Well, it is an enormous pleasure. And before I enumerate just why it's such a pleasure, I want to thank Jessica, No Relation Strand, and the Strand No Relation Bookstore for generously opening up the Rare Book Room to our seal play, if I might.
Our seal play? Is that your coinage?
No.
Okay.
I'm being misquoted. Blake Bailey, as if he needs an introduction, and I think he doesn't, but just to read the awards that Blake has won is enough to eat up the predominance of our time. Okay. Blake,
so maybe don't.
No, but they give me such pleasure to hear them because they're so well deserved. His first biography, which came out of nowhere, I don't think a single person knew that Blake Bailey was a biographer.
Because I wasn't.
Right, he wasn't. He was nothing. He was a nudnik. He was a freelancer. He was a Nachschlepper. His Richard Yates biography was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and he follows that in short order with Cheever, A Life, which wins the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Francis Parkman Prize, and is a finalist for the Pulitzer and the James Tate Black Memorial Prize. I can testify as a biographer, these are hard things to win. And he wins them all, All the money he carries away, all the prizes in the game. Plus a Guggenheim, right? Where was it?
Guggenheim, and an award in literature from the American Academy.
Yeah, now what does it mean to get an Academy Award? From the Academy of Arts and Letters. Yeah, but what is it?
I sat next to Martha Updike at the luncheon. That's what it means. You get to sit next to Martha Updike at the...
But what was it given for?
I think
a little early to have a Lifetime Achievement Award there.
We're not going to be talking about my awards all night, I promise. No. But since you asked,
yes,
the award in literature, I think, was originally conceived as given to writers of unusual promise. Like 7 are awarded every year. I'm in good company. Richard Yates is a past winner.
Okay.
John Cheever is a past winner. Truman Capote, Isaac Singer.
Charles Jackson.
Charles Jackson. I am so sorry. Charles Jackson won the award.
Really?
And he was sort of anomalous, though, because he won it sort of late in his career. Usually it's for people who are relatively early in their career.
But as your biography shows, he always...
Philip Roth won it.
Now
my latest subject, no one has mentioned. I'm writing a biography of Philip Roth.
I haven't done it yet. We haven't gotten to the personal yet.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay. Blake isn't even a New Yorker. It's stunning, it's weird, it's improbable that a man can carry away so many prizes and write so well and cover the literary milieu so thoroughly and not be a New Yorker. Beggars the imagination. He lives in Portsmouth, Virginia, and his wife, nota bene, is a pain management psychologist.
She is.
He teaches at Old Dominion when he chooses to, and I read a.
Sometimes I don't show up, you know.
I read an online discussion with Blake where he described his routine, which sounded delightful, involving an occasional jog, a few notes, a little reading, makes his lovely 8-year-old daughter dinner. Now, Blake and I have one thing in common, which you may not know, which is that, and I didn't know this because Blake hides his light under a very large Virginian bushel, but we each have a beagle. You have a beagle?
I do. But I didn't know this about Dan. We're talking about beagles. You know, these people came to hear about...
All right.
Okay.
So let's get on with Jackson. All right. Let's go to the tough questions, to the Charles Jackson questions. Okay. I think there's a question that we all would like to ask right off. There was Yates. Oh, I have to say, Blake is also working on a memoir called The Splendid Things We Planned.
It's written. It will be published almost exactly a year
so we'll circle back
today.
to that.
Yeah.
You don't want to talk about yourself, but you have a memoir coming up. Could this be what Blake calls the paradox of a highly compartmentalized personality? Okay, so we have Richard Yates. Richard Yates, right? This guy who is this intense small readership. He's a writer's writer, right? Then we go on there to Cheever, right? John Cheever, central mid-century American, icon, fictional icon, right? And then, so presumably Blake, like all the rest of us mere mortals, is looking around for another project. Project will I do? What project will I do? What project will I write? And you come upon Charles Jackson. I think we'd all, when I first heard it, I thought he'd come upon Shirley Jackson. And then it was Charles Jackson. So
So why? Why Charlie?
Yes, make your case for Charlie. And you do it in the biography, but make it here.
It can be easily done. I have long been a great admirer of The Lost Weekend. I read it first in college, and I've read it 5 or 6 times since then. The great portrait of an alcoholic in American literature remains, and perhaps will forever remain, Don Burnham. As he was aptly characterized in one of the reviews at the time, a mixture of Hamlet and Mr. Toad from The Wind and the Willows. What happened is I was going to write. I was completely fried after writing these 2 cinder block literary biographies, and I wanted to write something more modest. So I was going to do this little sort of Lytton Strachey-esque portraits in miniature about failed, forgotten writers, because I kept tripping across them in my research on Cheever and Yeats.
Who are some of the other?
Flannery Lewis, Calvin Kentfield, Nathan Ashe.
Wow.
Any takers for these guys?
When you said Flannery, I was with you, and then Lewis.
And I said Lewis, and it was like I threw you this big curveball, right? These writers were considered real up-and-comers in their day. And, Flannery Lewis, he published like 3 novels in 3 years. He peed in the Yaddo fountain and was almost thrown out personally by Elizabeth Ames. Wild guys, prolific guys, talented guys. You can't even Google them. They are gone. They never existed. Okay, they are in the ether. So I thought, this is fascinating. Why do some people make it? And if you ever read, there was an oral biography of Hemingway called The True Gen. Has anyone heard of that? Any Hemingway nuts? There. And Nathan Ashe, who died all the way back in 1962, was interviewed for this. And he talks sort of ruefully. He knew Hemingway. They were both in Paris in the 20s. He spoke ruefully about, I was talented, and Hemingway was talented. But he made it, and I didn't. And he talked about how Hemingway, the young Hemingway, would walk down the street in the Montparnasse, and he shed light as he walked, like Richard Cory, I guess, in the Edward Arlington Robinson. He was so charismatic. He was so charming. He had that smile, And so everyone reads Hemingway. Nathan Ashe was sort of this little nebbishy guy, and he's nowhere. Anyway, so I was interested in that, and I thought, well, who remembers Charles Jackson? And he wrote this wonderful novel, this classic in its time. So I went back to my dog-eared copy of The Lost Weekend. Yeah, I have the 1963 version, the Time Reading Program reprint. And I read the editors of Time had written a preface to that. And it said, Charles Jackson is now chairman of the New Brunswick, New Jersey AA chapter. And he's sober. And he's the doting father of 2 daughters, and so on. And I thought, wow, that sounds like a nice sort of redemptive fable story. And I Googled him and found out that he had died of an overdose at the Chelsea in 1968 and was living with a Czechoslovakian laborer named Stanley Zednik. And I thought, what happened to the family man? What happened to the sobriety? There's a story here. So I got in touch with the daughters. They were guarded, but very kind and courteous and helpful. And they directed me to the Dartmouth papers. And it turned out that there were like 20 boxes of papers in the basement. I knew a librarian at Dartmouth. He helped me a lot on Cheever. And he went down there, got them up.
Had they ever been looked at?
They had only recently been, there were 2 boxes before. One I had ordered. It was like 300 pages of letters from Charlie and his wife Rhoda to the brother Boom. Now, how many people here have read The Lost Weekend? 1, 2, 3. Okay, in The Lost Weekend, and okay, how many people have seen the movie? Yes. Okay. In the movie, you'll recall, Don lives with his brother, Wick, right? And by the way, that apartment in the movie is an exact replica of the apartment that Charles shared with his brother, Fred, called Boom, on East 55th Street. In the mid-30s, when Charlie was at the worst of his alcoholism, and his brother was trying to get him back on his feet again. So it was very much the same situation that you had in The Lost Weekend. So there were like 300 pages. There were 2 boxes of material at Dartmouth that had been cataloged. One were letters, 300 pages of letters, and the other was the original manuscript to The Lost Weekend, which Charlie had given to Dartmouth in 1949, so they'd been there for a long time.
Why Dartmouth, by the way?
Because he...
As Blake chronicles beautifully, Charles Jackson only lasted, I guess, a semester at Syracuse before. Was it a semester or a year that he last?
Ask me about that later, because that's kind of a whole different story. It's an important one.
I'm only pointing out that he was not that Charles Jackson did not finish college.
No, he did not finish a year at Syracuse, right. and that was a traumatic event in his life and in Don Burnham's life, if you've read The Lost Weekend. Charlie lived in Orford, New Hampshire, which is 17 miles upriver from Dartmouth. So that was sort of the cultural hub for where he lived, and it was natural to give the manuscript to Dartmouth.
Two boxes plus.
So 2 boxes. I read the letters. The 300 pages of letters confirmed everything that was in The Lost Weekend, that Charlie had been a mess, that he struggled with pill addiction later on in his life, that Boom, his brother, became very frustrated with him. The letters sort of taper off in the late 50s, suggesting that Boom was sick of Charlie's messing up. And Rhoda also comes across as very long-suffering, but very devoted too, because Charlie was the kindest, sweetest of men. And when he was sober, he was a wonderful husband, and he was a wonderful father. His daughters adore him to this day. So I read those things. There were those 2 boxes. I got in touch with Sarah and Kate, the daughters, and they said, no, there's at least 20 boxes. But we didn't relinquish them till 2002. In other words, 34 years after their father's death in 1968. So I got in touch with Eric, who's my librarian friend there, and he went down in the basement and found these boxes sort of shoved into a corner somewhere, and he dusted them off and brought them upstairs, and it was a treasure trove. It was practically every letter that he'd written as an adult, to Judy Garland, to Thomas Mann,
And is that the point where you decided that he would be your next...
That's why it was a fascinating story. I mean, it was a mystery to be solved. How did he go from sobriety, and why did he stop writing? He did not publish a novel from 1948 to 1967. What was he doing in between? I had no idea. I thought he became a used car salesman at some point, because there was this book, how to buy a used car by Charles R. Jackson. And I thought, wow, he became a used car salesman, and it turned out it wasn't the Charles Jackson, but I thought it was. And what's more, he went that long without publishing a novel, and the novel that he did publish the year before his death made the New York Times bestseller list. It was regarded as a huge event. Charlie was still famous in those days, and that the author of The Lost Weekend was coming back out of nowhere to publish this book. It did really well. He was on the Today Show. He was interviewed by Barbara Walters. Okay, yeah. It was a great story, and I had a ball working on it.
If you were to make a case for a book for fiction by Charles Jackson besides The Lost Weekend, what would you send us to read?
I would send you to read the 2 books that have been reissued by Vintage, very much at my behest. They asked me, what other than The Lost Weekend should we publish to coincide with your biography? And I said the first book of short stories, The Sunnier Side, which critics just raved about at the time. It was the most reviewed book of 1950, and the New York Times did an item about that of the 57 major reviewers that reviewed it, only 5 wrote negative reviews, which was that's huge, and it's regarded as the latter-day equivalent of Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio.
Well, that brings me to my next question, which is situate for us who are of a literary historical mindset. Where you'd put Charles Jackson in terms of American letters? In other words, who does he connect to? What traditions is he writing out of? Does he leave any descendants?
I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer, because The Lost Weekend, especially in its early couple of chapters, has almost what we scholars would call a Wavian quality. He writes like the early comic novels of Evelyn Waugh. Okay, Don Burnham is kind of this Chaplin-esque character stumbling from one calamity to another, and there's really sort of a funny, picaresque quality to it. Part of the book's genius is the way those early, picaresque, kind of funny, kind of Wavian chapters grade subtly into horror, in the latter part of the book. You almost don't notice it happening. You laugh. I mean, the book where he steals the purse, it is horrible, but in a way, there's a zany side to it. And Don Burnham has a sense of humor and an objectivity about his own comicalness, his own Mr. Toadness. Hence the Hamlet and Mr. Toad-like quality. On the one hand, he's clueless and self-absorbed like Mr. Toad, but there's another Don Burnham that appreciates his own self-deception.
But I mean, would you consider him a kind of a hyper-realist? Would you consider him coming out of a newspaper writing tradition, or even a teleplay?
He's not a hyper-realist at all. He's
coming out of a teleplay tradition, perhaps?
Do you want to just field?
I'm asking.
Okay.
I'm asking. I want to know so I know where to put my Lost Weekend on my bookshelf. Do I put him?
Is that how you categorize?
Yeah, I got a lot of mid-century
really weird,
American novelists, and I want to know. He needs a home.
No, he's certainly not a hyper-realist. He's among American writers. I think that the writer, and this is Charles Jackson, in no way acknowledges this debt, though he does acknowledge a debt to Waugh. Nathaniel West. Okay, there is a very sort of, again, black surreal zaniness to The Lost Weekend that one finds in, Miss Lonely Hearts and The Day of the Locust. But again, I think that affinity is purely is sort of an affinity of the cultural ethos.
He didn't read Nathaniel West.
There is no evidence that he ever read Nathaniel West, Nathaniel West died before The Lost Weekend was published, so that he probably didn't read Charles Jackson.
Okay, so the very first of reviews has come out for the Charles Jackson biography. No surprise that it's a rave. From Adam Kirsch, writing in the Wall Street Journal.
And you just give them the headline, I think.
Well, I was going to say, not only is the review a rave, but whoever wrote the headline, some editor likes Blake a lot, because although the review is a rave, the headline is a great American biography, and it's apparently got an enormous space to show. So all this is well deserved.
It's even better when you see it in the print version.
Had you happen to have it on you?
Because it's the Saturday.
Yeah.
I'm going to have it turned into a necktie or something.
So in this review, which is a rave, and a deserved rave, of Blake Bailey's new biography, Adam Kirsch, I think, playfully and charmingly posits the following axiom for biography, and I'm just wondering if you agree with it or disagree.
Okay.
Common sense suggests that the better a writer is, the more he deserves to have his story told, but it is precisely the genius's genius that no biographer can explain or usually even evoke. And therefore, Adam Kirsch goes on to say, by implication, somewhere along this continuum, the worse the writer, the more room there is for a great biography. Now, clearly, if you can't write it all,
I think there are nuances to what Adam actually said that alluded to your paraphrase of that.
No, but I'm asking you, do you agree with that? Is that something you thought about going into Charles Jackson? You think to yourself, if I do some immortal genius, then there's no room for me as a biographer?
No, let me answer that. First of all, he basically says Charles Jackson was not a genius, like Cheever, arguably like Yeats, and certainly like Philip Roth. He was just an above-average guy who dreamed of being a genius. No, that's not the mystery I was trying to solve. The mystery I was trying to solve was, how did the genius who wrote The Lost Weekend write such pedestrian books later? Okay? And, you can almost not recognize the author of The Lost Weekend in most of the work that followed. Not all of it. Now, you asked me which books were worthy of being reissued.
I did.
And again, The Sunnier Side is brilliant, mainly because, and especially the reissue, because I include a long story in there that was not in the original Sunnier Side, The Boy Who Ran Away.
Just tell us a little bit about what the Sunnier Side are largely autobiographical stories,
yes,
right?
It's the best of the later stories. It's a magnificent, it's almost a novella, and it's included in the vintage edition of the Sunnier Side. It will blow you away. Here's why. Here's the short answer for why Jackson never equaled the achievement of The Lost Weekend. Because he was always stoned when he was writing his later work. He wrote The Lost Weekend cold sober. He'd been sober for almost 8 years, and that was his talent. That was Charles Jackson writing on the beam. Okay, he was freaked out by the success of The Lost Weekend. And let me emphasize, again, we tend to forget that The Lost Weekend, the novel, was a hit. It's been so overshadowed by the movie. It sold 500,000 copies. It was in the Modern Library. It was turned into a comic strip. A syndicated comic strip. You know you've made it.
But it was booted out of the Modern Library.
But only because Bennett Cerf is a dick. Bennett Cerf had been courting Charlie for years to come away from Farrar and Reinhardt to Random House. And when the time came, Charlie did leave Farrar and Reinhardt, which is then Reinhardt and Company, because Farrar had joined up with Roger Strauss, and he followed Farrar to Farrar and Strauss. And Bennett Cerf retaliated by yanking The Lost Weekend from the Modern Library and replacing it with Little Women.
Why wasn't there room for both of them?
That's tough.
Why isn't there room for both of them? I never understood why you had to.
But I didn't really follow that previous thought to the end, so yes. May I do so? Okay, so Charlie was completely freaked out. I mean, he had Edmund Wilson raving about him, and like, what am I going to do now? I am just this misfit from the sticks. Little Newark, 20 miles from Lake Ontario, where they thought I was a goofball. And a sissy, I might add. So it freaked him out, and he was totally blocked, and he found the only way to unblock himself was to take Seconal, to take tranquilizers. Now, I found medical notes from this doctor. He wasn't even a psychiatrist who treated him in Hanover, Dr. Sven Gunderson. He also treated Robert Frost. He was a pulmonary specialist, but he was the one. Charlie liked him, so he would go to Mary Hitchcock Hospital and dry out whenever he overdosed or went on a bender or what have you. So Gunderson wrote, Mr. Jackson is addicted to Seconal. Okay, Seconals they're reds, they're tranquilizers, serious tranquilizers. What is this? I'm here.
My phone just kicked in. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. It sounded like someone had turned the TV on. Okay. And Gunderson said, Seconal is a powerful tranquilizer. However, oddly enough, it has the reverse effect on Mr. Jackson. Okay, when Charlie would take Seconal, he would become galvanized, right? And he'd soar, and just suddenly the thoughts would be rushing in, and he'd be writing in my paper. Now, I don't know if any of you are fiction writers, but it is axiomatic. You do not try to write fiction when you're drunk or stoned. It's always terrible. John Cheever knew that. John Cheever was taking his first drink of the morning earlier and earlier until he was sneaking into the pantry for a scoop of gin at 9 o'clock in the morning. But all that meant was he had to wrap up the writing at 8:45. He did not get the scoop of gin and then go write. He knew better. Charlie wanted to be a writer. He loved the idea of being a celebrated writer. Don Burnham, he has all these fantasies of being not only a genius writer, but a genius actor and a genius piano player and all that. That's Charlie. So he had to play out the role of the writer, and if that meant being addicted to Seconal for most of his adult life, that's what he had to do. But he did not write a single published word after The Lost Weekend that was not written under the influence of tranquilizers. Why the Sunnier Side is so good is because two of its best long stories, Palm Sunday and Rachel's Summer, were written in 1939 when he was still sober, before he'd even written The Lost Weekend. And they're pioneering. Palm Sunday is a totally true story. Charlie was a completely autobiographical writer about how he was molested by the choir master in his poisonous small town when he was 14. And Rachel Summer is about Thelma being hit by the train. And Charlie's sister and brother were killed by a train when he was 13. And in the small town, Newark, rather than comforting the family as they might have, they instead spread a rumor that Thelma had been pregnant at the time she died, and that God in his infinite wisdom had taken her before the disgrace became obvious. And this rumor blighted Charlie's mother's life for the rest of her years. Why are you interrupting?
I'm sorry, because sooner or later we have to move to the next subject. Okay. I know you barely got a word out.
You're like Leonard Lopez.
Barely got a word.
The man doesn't let you talk.
Barely got a word out.
Okay.
I'm still wondering what makes a good subject for a biography, because Adam Kirsch posits that it's possible for a subject to have too much talent, to be too great a writer to make. Now, I'm just wondering, do you agree with that? Is there, if there were a biographer in the making out here, like what would you tell him or her to look for?
I would tell the prerequisite of writing a literary biography is make sure you admire the work. Okay, because if you don't admire the work, you're going to waste a lot of your time on miserable labor, because it's excruciating. You've got to be obsessive to write a decent. And I'm, as you may notice, I'm wired pretty tight, right? So I'm the man for the job. Admire the work and have a good story. Charlie was a great story. Here's a man who wrote a novel of genius. He never equaled the achievement, but he never stopped trying. In the meantime, he got into one horrific scrape after another. He got tuberculosis. He had this closeted gay mentor who, made sure that he and his gorgeous brother, also gay, Boom, lived a life of luxury in Davos, Switzerland. Bronson Winthrop, I never got to finish that, was this big Wall Street lawyer, the partner of Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War in FDR's cabinet. And he was fabulously wealthy and erudite and cultured. And Charlie was his protege, and he was a closeted gay man.
Do you think there was no romantic involvement between Bronson Winthrop and either of the brothers?
No. Bronson Winthrop was a big fan of Plato. His
That's what they all say.
That's what they all say. The father, Egerton, who has a celebrated portrait by Sargent. Egerton was Edith Wharton's best friend. Okay, and Bronson, he had this gallery of pictures of his proteges over the years, but Charlie insisted he was the most innocent man I ever met. Now, Boom definitely stirred Bronson. I mean, Charlie had the platonic sort of intellectual friendship with Bronson, and Bronson saw Boom and said, I'd like to sublimate my passion for that. I have a gorgeous picture of Boom in my book that you should check out.
Let's talk a little bit about your processes, because you're an unusually productive biographer. One senses very little time wasted, despite the carpools with the 8-year-old daughter and the
that's why I get so antic in public, because I never leave my room.
So you told. But you have to teach from time to time. You told the Daily Beast, if I have this right, that your process is you take 3 pages of single-space notes and turn it into 2 pages of finished prose. And I'm wondering about that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Doesn't everybody?
Process.
That's what do you do, Dan?
I have no such equation.
You have no such equation.
No, but I'm curious. Actually, I'm really curious. How do you establish those pages of single-space? In other words, is there a way that you accumulate your notes first so that you have this like incredibly beautiful sort of pile of a book in waiting, and then you sort of take it and you begin to write it out of a complete stack of notes?
Yes. When you're done with your research after however many years, your computer is ready to explode, okay, with undifferentiated data that you need to put in order. So what I do is I go and I lie down on a comfortable couch. I have a very comfortable couch in my study. You asked.
Yeah.
With a legal
Imagine
pad.
the
I
beagle,
don't allow myself to look at anything. I consult nothing.
The beagle
is lying. I've got my legs over the beagle. Okay. She loves that. And I write down all the major episodes of my subject's life. And again, if it doesn't occur to me off the top of my head, it's not worth writing down. Okay? So I fill up a legal pad, and then I type that up, and then I cut and paste, and then I start thinking about structure. You know, do I want to be strictly chronological? No. I want to be thematic. You know, I want to talk about the alcoholism here, and I want to talk about his doting relationship with his daughters here, and this incident attaches nicely to this theme, and blah, blah. So after about a year, I have a rough structure. And I'm starting to plug in a rough structure. It's extremely complex by then. Then I'm plugging in the research, plugging it in, plugging in. Say I've interviewed a couple of hundred people, and I have 5 versions of this anecdote. You know, I take the best line from each. You know, this person told it best, and blah, blah, blah. And as you're going along, you're throwing stuff out, winnowing. And the structure is refining itself. Finally, after about 2 years, I have every line in place. I have, say, 700 pages of single-spaced notes. I know exactly how the book is laid out, and I can start writing. And, you know, producing 2 double-spaced pages of finished prose a day is tough, but if you've got your notes in order, it's completely doable.
So you're able to sit there at a certain moment and say you're 2/3 of the way through the writing of your biography.
I know I can calculate mathematically how many days more I have until I'm going to be finished.
So when your daughter says, "Daddy, when are you going to be done?" you actually can give an answer.
June 14th.
June 14th at
Yeah.
about 5 p.m. Do you ever find that you've made a mistake and that you've collected notes on something that no longer, that part of the life doesn't interest you as much as
Yes. The only real glitches that I encounter once I have my notes is as I realize that I don't really have to include this. This is superfluous, and that's great. Because that means that I've finished the 3 pages or whatever, or I can finish early that day. Because I don't really need to put that in there, and I only need to write 1 paragraph today, and I've done my allotment, and I can take a walk, go to a movie.
When I look at the people who you've biographized, and I know we spoke of Charles Jackson as the exception at first, but let's look at a different point of view. We have in Richard Yates an anguished, alcoholic, middle-aged writer with possible bisexual tendencies.
Richard Yates?
Yeah.
I wouldn't agree with the bisexual. I mean, I've kind of vacillated about that, but I didn't put it in the book.
The reviewers did. You'd not put it in the book. You don't think that's true?
The Yates had bisexual tendencies? I think he was terrified of being perceived as a sissy because he was a mama's boy. He had this drunken, overprotective mother as a child, and it was a nightmarish childhood, and he clung to her skirts because he had nothing else to cling to. So the rest of his life, he played this bogus man's man sort of persona. But I don't think that points to the sexual proclivities.
Then I'm going to withdraw the question. I'm going to ask you this one.
Which is why do I always write about bisexual?
No, I was going to say, you've written about 3, all right, let me try and rephrase it in a way that will squeak past the biographer's gaze. All right, so you've written about 3 middle-aged men in anguish.
They weren't always middle-aged.
Well, they in anguish.
Why don't you say I wrote about 3 babies?
In anguish relationship to their prose, heavily alcoholic.
Yes.
And basically blocked, right? Awful. Each one, well, Charles Jackson perhaps less awful in a way, friendlier than the others. But anyway, and then comes Philip Roth. How do you fit him into your paradigm? You once said, and I quoted it earlier, that the aim of biography is to capture the paradox of a highly compartmentalized personality.
Every writer is a mass of contradictions. Every human being is a mass of contradictions.
I don't have to pay $25.95 to find that out. I'm asking you, why Roth? Give me Roth.
Listen, smart guy. Okay. Yeah, you want to know about Roth, right? But I'm trying to. I'm trying to work. You're not going to let me work toward that. Yeah, I mean, Roth will prove to be no less of a paradox and no less of a compartmentalized personality in different ways than. I mean, the fundamental contradiction of Roth is sort of the dialectic between Mickey Sabbath and Swede Lvov, okay? And this is how Roth himself characterized it. I wrote about a very bad man, and then I wanted to write about a very good man, okay? And those are the two fundamental sides of Philip Roth's personality. I mean, one side is a total anarchist, and deliberately, well, I don't want to get myself in trouble here. He is alive.
Turn off that camera.
Oh. To hell with this. No, I mean, Roth himself would say, you know, I mean, there's the Portnoy, there's the Mickey Sabbath, you know, there's the raffish, carousing personality. Not an alcoholic personality. He's a Jew. The Jews don't drink. And then there is the good boy. I mean, I was with Barbara Sproul, his girlfriend, for 5 years, for 3 hours today. And, you know, her line on Philip is the goodest of good boys. You know, he wants to fix things. He wants to help you out. He is disciplined as a monk. Okay? He leads us. But people who spend... Again, I can relate to this. People who spend a lot of time away from the world, locked in a room, there's another side to that. You're eager to get out and have some fun when it's all over. Okay? So what was the question?
Philip Roth in the New York Times. I work for Blake Bailey now.
He does. He works
You're
for
giving him $10.99 at the end of the year? Well, how did that happen? How did you know, to be honest, you carried off.
How did this come about?
Let me puff you a bit here, all right?
Do it.
He carries off the greatest remaining prize, I'd say, in American letters, the person about whom we most want to know things, and a person who's very much kept away from biographers and even written some quite unpleasant things about biography and biographers. If you had asked me, I'd have said, you know, Philip Roth will die without a biographer. And then I open up my New York Times, which I still get on paper, thank you, and I see, I work for Blake Bailey now. Take us inside the room. How did it happen?
This is how it happened. Almost exactly a year ago today, I was having breakfast with James Atlas. Have you guys heard of James Atlas? Yeah, he wrote a biography of Saul Bellow. He now mostly publishes these mini biographies for Amazon and Houghton Mifflin. And he wanted me to write one of those books. He wanted me to write that book about literary failures. But having finished a large book about Charles Jackson, I was kind of over that subject for the time being. And so he mentioned that Philip Roth and my predecessor had parted company. And I said, well, Jim, this is for you. You know, you're Bellows' biographer. You're a Jew. You know, you gotta take this. And he said, no, he and Roth have kind of a problematic history, and et cetera. So I told Jim that I'd think about writing the little literary failure book, and I went home and wrote a letter to Philip Roth saying, I'm available, I'm between projects, you remember me, we corresponded about my Cheever book, because he and Cheever were friends. And about a week later, I was on a weekend trip with my family, and I was driving over this narrow, rickety bridge on the eastern shore of Virginia, and my brand new iPhone rang. And I didn't really, you know, and it said blocked. You know, when you look at the screen, it said blocked. And I thought it was the Obama campaign, because I had look, it's Lisa Halliday and Theo, her husband. Hi, you guys. I'm so glad you came.
The question, just for those just arriving, was, I work for Blake Bailey now, Philip Roth, the New York Times.
How did I come to write Philip's biography? So it said blocked, and I thought it was the Obamas, because they had been calling me incessantly because I had volunteered for the 2008 campaign. But when they call, it says unknown. So my wife is saying, keep your eyes on the road. And I said, I should take this. It doesn't say unknown. She snapped it out of my hand and says, it's the Obamas, for Christ's sake, watch the road. We're going to drive off the bridge. So I got back to my bed and breakfast, and I'm soaking in a tub, and I pick up my message. Philip Roth is in my voice. I'm like, and you know, while I do a pretty killer imitation of Cheever and Charles Jackson, I'm not going to retail it tonight because the daughters are here, and that's awkward. But I can't do Philip Roth. He has this lovely, sonorous, sort of Murrow-esque kind of voice. Watch American Masters on March 29th. The Philip Roth documentary is going to be on. It's good. So anyway, here's Philip Roth. He got my letter. He wants to talk to me. And so I immediately try to call him back. And it's one of those cheesy Verizon answering services where it says, the person you're trying to call is not available. Click. You can't even leave a damn message for them. So I thought, I said to my wife, thanks, babe. Now I can't be Philip Roth's biographer. But I went home, and sure enough, a couple of days later, it rang again and said blocked. And, I threw myself on the phone. It was Philip Roth again. And he immediately launches into this story. Not only was I John Cheever's friend, I knew Charles Jackson. And he tells me this story about I got out of the Army in 1956. I needed a job. My brother Sandy was an art director at J. Walter Thompson, and Charlie was a script editor at Kraft TV Theater, which was produced by J. Walter Thompson. So he had an interview with Charlie. He tells me this story. And then he stops, and there's a pensive pause. And Roth says, do you ever write about someone who's alive and not drunk all the time? And I said, no. I said, you would be my first, and I'd really like to talk about it. As it happened, I was coming back to New York the following month, and he said, well, come by. So I went to his apartment in the West 70s, and he was there, and we just chatted. And a friend of his showed up. I later realized that this was a friend whose judgment he deeply trusts. And they're talking about how the friend's daughter, an 8-year-old girl named Amelia, collaborates with Philip on stories. He'll email her a line, and she'll piggyback on it, and they'll keep emailing back and forth until the story's finished. Isn't that cute? Philip Roth collaborates. He's not retired. He writes stories with an 8-year-old girl named Amelia. Well, as it happens, I have an 8-year-old daughter named Amelia. And whereas this friend was a psychiatrist, my wife is a psychologist. So, already it's kind of this karmic thing, right? And but 2 hours pass, and I've got to go to the Cheever Centennial at the 92nd Street Y. I say, I got to go. Where are we leaving this? And he says, well, come back in a couple of days. And it was a perfectly friendly, wonderful, convivial visit. So I come back. It's Saturday morning. There's no one there but the housekeeper. She doesn't speak English. And Philip, he's perfectly polite, but he's grim. He's not convivial. And I asked him solicitously about his back. He's got an aching back, and it was recently operated on. He said, you didn't come here to talk to me about my back. I'm like, oh, shit. And he claps on these glasses, and he says, I have some questions for you. And he says, why? And he's reading from a pad, okay? He says, why should a Gentile from Oklahoma write my biography? Takes off the glasses and waits for me to answer. And I said, well, I'm not a bisexual alcoholic with an ancient Puritan lineage, but I wrote a biography of John Cheever, which surprisingly enough was more or less the right answer. But there were many more questions. He asked me, he said, relate my work to that of Bellow and Malamud and the Jewish literary tradition in America. It went on for 3 hours.
What did you answer to that?
It was a long answer.
Yeah.
It was tough.
It's a difficult question.
It was tough. And occasionally, but he made it a little easier because he'd get impatient with whatever you were trying to say, and he'd answer it for you, And, but at the end of that, he said, okay, well, this has gone well, and I've enjoyed this, and I'll get back to you. And he did. And then Andrew Wiley called to put the seal on it and said, you're Philip Roth's biographer. And we signed an agreement. And within a month, I had a pile of papers practically going up to the ceiling that he had sent me. And these private papers, now in my office, when I'm done with this book, will be relinquished to the Library of Congress and remain under seal until 2050. So that's how lucky I am.
But he also admired your work, right? He had read the Cheever.
He had read both Cheever and Yates.
And what did he say about them?
He loved them, and I'm not going to false modesty about that. I mean, that's true. I found he sent me this stuff that he had written, complain about why he was disenchanted with my predecessor, and mainly because my predecessor wasn't interviewing anyone. He'd been on the job for 9 years, and he'd interviewed 9 people, one a year,
time to do the interview.
And he said, this is something he wrote before we had ever spoken. We corresponded a little because I needed his help with my Cheever book, but I had never spoken to Philip. And he wrote, in Blake Bailey's marvelous Cheever biography, I'm looking at his acknowledgement pages, and he interviewed 200 people. And in Zachary Leader's Zachary Leader's writing a biography of Saul Bellow, he's already interviewed over 100 people, and blah blah blah. So I knew, he told me, I loved your Cheever book, I loved your Yates book, but then I saw it in black and white. He'd been writing about my book as sort of an example of what my predecessor was not doing.
And has he read the Jackson?
Yes, he loved it. He loved it. He said he called me up as soon he finished it in 3 days. That's pretty good. And he called up and said, Blake, this is really wonderful. I don't know if it's going to be a big seller. He said, I don't know if it's going to be a big seller, Blake, but this was consoling me. He was consoling me. He said, I don't know if it's going to be a big seller, Blake. It's wonderful, and you and I know that, and that's all you need.
Whoa, that's a small.
And I know how good this book is.
That's a small print run.
Yeah, and it turns out Adam Kirsch knew it too. So
that's right.
Yeah, there you go.
No, and I think many more will know it before you leave town. No,
it's a great yarn, I mean.
Did you ever worry whether you had the chops for any of these books, including the Roth? In other words, did you ever wonder if you were outside of what you're celebrated in your biographies for many qualities. What one thing that comes up again and again is the sort of humanity. Adam Kirsch again. Mr. Bailey has made an author come alive in a way that is truly novelistic, a kind of miracle, one that we can all be grateful for. In other places, one sees in the early reviews of your earlier biographies, that you capture the subject's humanity, humanness, that kind of thing. I'm just wondering whether, that obviously requires a certain act of empathy on your part.
I want to
make it sound very dry and technical, but obviously no. There's an act of a human being encountering another human being going on in your pages.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a generously worded question, Dan. I appreciate it.
Just quoting Adam Kirsch.
There you go. There's a character in Exit Ghost, Philip Ross, Exit Ghost, and it's a young would-be literary biographer, Richard Kleeman.
Widely taken to be James Atlas?
Widely thought to be But I don't subscribe to that. Anyway, he wants to write a sort of pathography of E.I. Lonoff, Nathan Zuckerman's revered mentor. And his thesis, Kleeman's thesis, is that Lonoff had an incestuous relationship. This is kind of informed by the Henry Roth story, that he had an incestuous relationship with his half-sister, and that this scandal, this trauma, shaped his whole life and shaped his whole work, okay? Now, this is what Philip hates. Okay, he hates tendentiousness, he hates pat generalizations, he hates psychobabble, and this is what a bad biographer does. A bad biographer reaches a general opinion about his subject, just to make it accessible. He's a good man or he's a bad man. Albert Goldman's Elvis book. Anyone read Elvis by Albert Goldman? It's poisonous, okay? And
you can put that on your jacket.
Anything that contradicts the fundamental thesis that Elvis was a fat, drug-ridden degenerate is swept under the rug, okay? Nothing that won't readily attach to that thesis is discarded. Okay, that is the opposite. This sounds self-aggrandizing, make of that what you will, but that's the opposite of how I work. I gather all the evidence, everything I can get my hands on, everyone's testimony, and it is wildly contradictory. I heard things about Cheever from his detractors that would absolutely make your hair stand on end. Okay? You take it all, and you balance it, and you sift it, and you find out what are the themes. The themes are multifarious in any human life, especially a writer's life. F. Scott Fitzgerald said there could never be a good biography of a good writer because he's too many people if he's any good. Okay? You have to keep an open mind because there are too many, your subject is too contradictory, and you've got to somehow reconcile all those contradictions. So I approach as a human being. There are aspects to my nature that are despicable, and who knows them better than I do?
Your wife?
Yeah, my wife. Okay.
Remember, she's a pain management psychologist.
I mean, but I am not the sum of my despicable qualities, And in a great artist, despicable qualities are writ even larger. But so are the virtues.
Now, I'm very intrigued by your writing a memoir. Usually the biographer disappears behind the subject. That's the standard position. We don't know anything about Blake, really. I mean, well, his biographer will know something about him, but it's not easy to find the Blake Bailey hiding in the Charles Jackson. Beyond the sort of rudimentary questions, why did you choose this author, how do you identify him? But The Splendid Things We Planned, it's a very alluring title. It has a kind of jazz age kind of thing. It almost seems like it fits into one of your, the quality that all your authors have of being, success or not, they always seem to want something they don't quite get. Maybe that's part of the literary life, but, I think of John Cheever with his sort of imagining of himself as a kind of grand Brahmin gentleman, or Charles Jackson, who's always...
But knowing all the while that he's not.
Right. His mother having run a gift shop. And I think of, Charles Jackson, one of the really things I think that Blake captures beautifully in the book is that Jackson is ravenous for acceptance. I mean, he never quite, there's always another room he wants to be invited into. And so, for instance, early on, when he has a choice between being a commercial writer and a non-commercial writer, he goes for the Partisan Review, and then he goes to Hollywood, and Hollywood, you can imagine what Hollywood would do to any but the most stable personality. And there's nowhere in Blake's book is there a suggestion that Charles Jackson was the most grounded of individuals. So, circling back, what's in this memoir? What were the splendid things and who's the we?
The Splendid Things We Planned is a line from a song, Yesterday when I was young. Yesterday when I was young, so many things I planned, blah, blah, blah. It's this guy who's washed up and his life has come to nothing. And he's thinking, wow, I really blew it. It's a terribly sad song. It was my brother's, one of his favorite songs, because my brother led a catastrophic and ultimately tragic life. And he was an alcoholic and he was an addict. So we're getting a little peek on perhaps why I am fascinated by those kinds of people. But the we, to take your question directly, is my family. We were all unhappy one with the other. And not because we disliked each other, not that we didn't love one another. I think all families find sort of who said it about the jostling egos, the sheer proximity of other human beings that you're supposed to love, and, it's tough. But my family was it was a disaster. Because my brother was crazy, but in a unfortunately lovable way, and he was an addict, and he was always trying to fix himself and never succeeding, and we all suffered from that. But at the same time, we were all trying to sort of be happy in our own way, and our own ways conflicted with each other's ways, and we were constantly getting in the way of each other's happiness. And meanwhile, we had this tragic character in our midst.
And the book doesn't take you to the present day, I'm presuming. It's
almost. Scott killed himself about 10 years ago, and I sort of speak of the aftermath of that.
And was it hard for you? I mean, you had spent so much of your professional life, well, there was a coffee table book, but we won't talk about that. So much of your acknowledged professional life writing about other people, and even the methodology that you describe, where there's a kind of categorical quality to it and a very definitive quality. And I'm just wondering if not those techniques literally, but if that process was how you proceeded in your
No, it was
memoir.
much more like writing fiction, and for that reason, the critics will probably say, the main line will be Blake Bailey should stick to what he does best.
We don't know that. A great, a great
to
American
answer,
memoir, Wall Street Journal. I see it already.
Wow. Wow, that would be great. I took kind of a Gatsby approach in that I'm arguably sort of a Nick Carraway. I'm sort of a peripheral narrator, and Scott is the main subject. But of course, that's disingenuous because The Great Gatsby is not really about Gatsby. It's about Nick. And I mean, if you want to go to rudimentary terms, you define your main character as the character who changes most fundamentally over the course of the story. And Gatsby doesn't change. Gatsby dies with his illusions tragically intact. But Nick is forever disabused of the romantic notions that he attached to the rich of Long Island. And he goes back to the Midwest and so on. My brother's tragedy ultimately affected me and changed me in possibly saved my life by way of negative example. Because Scott, my brother, was the person most like me in the world. Quirks and addictive tendencies and all that. So it's the story of what I might have been and what, at least not yet, I didn't become.
Did you write it at the same time as you were working on the Charles Jackson biography? Did you alternate? How did you?
I worked on it intermittently because basically the book I had proposed after my Yeats book tanked. Picador rejected it. I didn't write the whole book, thank God. I submitted a proposal. Yeats had not been published yet when I submitted the proposal because Yeats was a big critical hit. They would have taken it if I had waited a little bit. But it was a good thing because I had 2 books rejected, 2 proposals rejected. It was a nightmare. And I had nothing to work on. I was going crazy. So I started to write the memoir, and then I got the Cheever book. And that was the best thing that ever happened to me, hands down.
Well, Jessica, are we at the question? I don't know. I see you there, but I don't know whether your body language means time for questions or.
Let's take like, I don't know, we'll see. Are there
Questions? Yes.
This isn't exactly a question, but I just want to say I think the book is gorgeous looking.
My book?
Yes, your book.
Isn't it, though? Isn't it
Anyway,
handsome?
I really love the cover and the
Thanks,
big picture
thanks,
of
I do
Charles
too.
Jackson.
Yeah.
But I'm just reading At It now,
Sure.
since I picked it up
It's
on
a
Monday
long
at Film
book.
Forum. And I was disappointed to read that it was the publisher that turned Long into Lost, that Charles Jackson had titled it.
This is the book he was trying to write, The Long Weekend.
Wow. Let me see that.
Coincidence? Do I come
Long
prepared?
Weekend by Robert. That's right.
I'm a seal who comes prepared.
A Social
Yeah.
History of Great Britain. What happened was, Charlie he started with the title Present Fears from Macbeth, and The Lost Weekend is full of Macbeth allusions. Don Burnham, the great Burnham Wood, okay? And he found out, like, a couple of months before publication that there were all these other books called The Long Weekend, and he was like, "Oh no, what'll I do now?" And an editor at Farrar and Reinhardt said, "Yeah, we'll change it to The Lost Weekend."
Do we know who it was? That name is. No?
It was like some lower down, yeah. But it became a phrase of the language, It became almost a clinical term. Any other questions?
Oh, here.
You mentioned how important finding Jackson's letters were to kind of opening up the character. Do you want to talk at all about how you feel our walking away from the letter writing life is going to affect biographies in the future?
It's a disaster. I was talking to my now former editor, Deb Garrison at Knopf today. Deb is a dear, dear friend, so it doesn't matter that she's no longer my editor. The Roth book, now I feel I have to explain that. The Roth book went to auction, and Norton prevailed at the auction, so I now have a new editor, and they bought my memoir too, so that was sweet. Anyway, to answer your question, Deb Knopf changed floors in the building recently, and she had all these invaluable letters from poets that she's edited, like Anthony Hecht and so on. And they had a big bank of file cabinets for paper letters. And when they moved, Deb couldn't find the letters anymore because she now has one little file cabinet about this high, and all that stuff has gone to off-site storage. But more and more, I was at the New York Public Library yesterday, going through the Farrar Straus papers. That was Philip Roth's publisher for a long time. And it's fascinating. It's great. It's indispensable, this stuff. But now it's all email. No one's gonna print all this stuff out. And what? So you keep it on a disk? Well, by the time you want it 10 or 20 years from now, there's not going to be the technology to accommodate that disk. Disks won't exist. Or, the machine that's going to, you know what I'm saying? I mean, like floppies? They were saving them on floppies. What are you going to feed a floppy into these days? So it's a terrible disaster because far and away, the most invaluable resource for a biographer is letters. Because as candid as a person's going to be with you in an interview, you'll go to the letter. That's a contemporaneous account. It is 90% more accurate than what people are going to tell you in interviews. And we're not going to have letters. And writers are letter writers, and they don't exist anymore.
If I might, in a tiny, tiny way, disagree with Blake, which is very, very rare.
Right. We butted heads about this
I just think that there was a period that was worse when people were using the telephone almost exclusively. And that's why you have this sort of oral biography thing in the 70s. And that actually we live in a time of relative plenty where we're not going to go back to the, era where people wrote wonderful 5-page long letters to describe what had gone on, at the country house that weekend. But at least we have something. And as for the floppies,
That's a totally spurious point.
It's now all up. It'll all be up in the sky waiting for future biographers. It'll be in the cloud, and when you want to write
it ain't going to work out that way.
Well, you feel that we're now in the desert. It's the golden era of biography is.
Well, I mean, this is going to almost fatally complicate the task. That's what I'm saying. And to accomplish what Leon Edel accomplished or Richard Ellman, that is not going to be possible without letters, proper letters as a source.
And in all your biographies, you had good letters, of course.
Yes, I had wonderful letters.
And Roth's letters are now on the second floor of your house in Portsmouth?
Yeah, but there's, the thing that must be disconcerting for Philip is you write a letter and you mail it away. And it's no longer yours. It's out there. You have copyright on it, but it is possessed by someone else. And for example, one of many, Philip wrote almost 200 letters to his pal Ted Solotaroff, the editor and writer and critic. And Ted was hard up toward the end of his life. He needed money, so he sold all his papers to the New York Public Library, including all these letters that Philip wrote. Now, on the one hand, Philip is ambivalent. He wants to help me as much as possible. He's given me all these papers, a lot of them of a highly intimate nature. But I'm imagining it must be disconcerting to know that there's someone out there now, me, trying to get all these personal letters. And he signed an agreement with me. He can't object to it because he has to cooperate along those lines. But, they're out there.
There's
hundreds and hundreds, possibly thousands of letters.
There's a wonderful letter from Philip Roth to Don DeLillo in the Ransom Center archives that
Is that from Ransom? I thought that was at the Library of Congress.
No, I read it at the Ransom Center. Terrific letter. And if you're nice to me, I have a copy in my phone.
Thanks. Well, I'll try to.
I don't know. I'm feeling done-ish, if that's not inappropriate.
I think this is perfect.
I want to
life and death of the biography.
Yeah, I want to thank Blake, who's written a terrific biography. All joking aside, I think that with the Charles Jackson, he shows again why he is. I think think the very best biographer of my generation.
Hold on, I'm not going to let him.
No.
I was one of the first. I was one of the first, or the first person
That's
to
true.
blurb Dan's.
He didn't even know me.
Magnificent book about David Foster Wallace. I was trying to sandbag him. I had a mole at Viking because I wanted to write the biography of David Foster Wallace. I was hoping he would fail. And I had Josh Kendall, my editor on the Yates book, was now at Viking, and I said, okay, what's going on with this? You got a manuscript yet? Can I see it? And so I got an early galley. And I read it and I thought, to hell with it, I mean, because it was so damn good. And instead of sandbagging him, I wrote a glowing blurb because it was just terrific.
And I was so naive. I thought it was there was this wonderful Blake Bailey, this famous biographer, had written this glowing blurb of my book, and I was so touched because I hadn't even solicited a blurb from him. I didn't even know him, which I think proves the old biographer's adage that there's no fool like an old fool. Thank you, Blake, for doing that for me.
My pleasure. Thank you guys
both.
for coming.
Thank you.